Hey there, interwebs. So, just content warning here. We're going to be talking about some pretty dark stuff like genocide and even more specifically the Holocaust. So, just be aware of that before we get into this video. It's going to be kind of a rough one. But for those of you who have not heard, JK Rowling recently tweeted about the Nazi crimes against transgender people, and people have been talking about that. And recently, a journalist, Rebecca Brown, who is in the United Kingdom, tweeted the quote that JK Rowling is a Holocaust denier. But then even more recently, she had to post on her Twitter account a retraction of that statement. And while, at least at this point of me filming this video, I don't know for sure if JK Rowling directly had legal teams reach out to Rebecca Brown, more than likely just the wording of the statement and its specificity, like even stating the date upon which she made that original tweet, makes it appear as though JK Rowling targeted Rebecca Brown with some form of libel laws that are in the United Kingdom to make Rebecca make a retraction of her statement. But why did Rebecca have to retract that statement when it's quite clear, as is sort of pointed out and discussed in further detail in these wonderful videos by my fellow YouTubers, that J.K. Rowling did, in fact, deny the crimes of the Nazis against the transgender people? Well, this is something I want to talk a little briefly about, and also talk about why I, if you go on my Twitter, got into a little bit of a kerfuffle with specific people, which is always frustrating. Twitter is never a good place to have any sort of nuanced discourse. It's just a terrible place in general for numerous reasons, but regardless, why I was being very specific in how I was discussing J.K. Rowling and her denial of Nazi crimes, and even now am being very specific in my wording of that. And I think this is very important just because it kind of gets into a lot of history around the Holocaust, Jewish folks, as well as trans folks, queer folks, and other groups that were targeted in the Holocaust, and how it is approached legally, how we think about it in terms of, our everyday discussion of events like the Holocaust. And I kind of want to just have a general discussion of it. And again, this is meant as a primer. There's much deeper dives that you can go into on all of this information. And again, Kaylee and Conrad's video of the ones that I showed earlier actually touches upon this in detail as well. But let's just talk about it generally here. Before we get to the J.K. Rowling of it all, let's talk a little bit about the Holocaust and what the Holocaust means. When we think about the Holocaust, generally most people in our society today think of the Jewish folks that were killed in the Holocaust. And that is very, very easily understandable why we do that. Jewish people were the direct targets of the Nazis. Estimated 6 million Jewish people, along with millions of non-Jewish people, were killed in the Holocaust in the actions of the Nazis and their collaborators. But essentially the Nazi rhetoric at the time was that the German people were the rightful inheritors of the sort of Aryan bloodline, and that while the Nazis and Germans themselves were not specifically like the distilled Aryans, they contained the ability in their bloodline, so they believed, to be able to breed a Übermensch, the perfect man, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed, strong dude that we sort of always think about when we think about like the Nazis' eugenics ideals. They did, again, and important to recognize that the Nazis didn't believe that they were specifically right now the Übermensch, the Aryan people, but had that bloodline within them. And that all other different types of peoples that were like different versions of human beings, and that the Aryan people were the strongest ones, and that their job as Nazis was to try to breed this Übermensch and prove that the Aryan people were, again, the Third Reich, bring around this sort of fascistic utopian built on this eugenics ideal. Now, Jewish people were also seen as a distinct group of people, and they used a lot of rhetoric to specifically target Jewish people to be able to say that Jewish people were lesser, they were dirt, they were rats, they were disgusting, not even humans. And not only that, the other element of their rhetoric was to say that the Jewish people were specifically trying to dilute the Aryan bloodline so that the Jewish people could promote their own bloodlines. Again, this ties into like blood libelist sort of rhetoric, stuff that we even see today. It kind of ties into like white replacement theory and sort of... My door keeps opening and closing. Apologies. There's a ghost in my house. The white replacement theory that we see today. Again, it goes all of these like eugenics ideals that we have sort of always seen in these neo-Nazi fascist groups. But that the specific thing where Jewish people were the ones causing this dilution of the Aryans because they were trying to do it specifically. That was the rhetoric. So the Nazis were specifically targeting Jewish people in the Holocaust. That being said, though, there were numerous other groups that were also targeted in the Holocaust for various different reasons, be they racialized, sexualized, religious, or numerous other reasons. The Jewish people were racialized, as we just discussed, but for example, you could look at how trans people were targeted by the Nazis. Again, I would highly recommend Kaylee and Conrad's excellent video on this, but essentially what Nazis were talking about was how Jewish people were trying to turn people trans and gay in order to dilute, again, the Aryan bloodline. That was part of like how they saw like Jewish people trying to dilute trying to dilute the Aryan race by making people gay and trans. And so what Nazis would do often was actually take trans people and that they saw as Aryan specifically and put them into conversion therapy camps, as well as queer people, and try to, say that they were brainwashed, maybe that these people are unsalvageable, but we'll try to, save their bloodlines and be able to breed them. Very gross, disgusting stuff. Now, I'm not going to go into a super detailed history within this video, as I have been planning for a long while and will hopefully do soon a video on trans people under the Nazi regime that I've just not had the time or energy to devote to due to how busy I've been with my own movie, nor the mental health energy that it would take to write about that sort of stuff. However, to quick debunk one common misconception that anti-trans bigots like Rowling have used to deny Nazi crimes against trans people, no, trans people were not just accidentally victimized by the Nazis while being seen as gay because they were targeting gay people, but trans people were targeted for being trans by the Nazis. While there's not been a ton of scholarship on how trans people were targeted by the Nazis due to a lack of specific study of trans people mixed with the destruction and burying of info on trans people by the Nazis themselves and those who came after, recent scholarship has found that yes, trans people often did live in a liminal space as transgender people, especially if they were viewed as Aryan, as opposed to racialized transgender people who were just sent often to concentration camps. This liminal space that I'm referring to is that, yes, sometimes trans people seen as Aryan were sometimes just viewed as gay men by the Nazis regime and targeted under laws prohibiting homosexuality. However, Nazis did specifically target trans people for being trans with hostility, harassment, and violence. Take, for example, Laurie Morhofer's work, where she points out a 1938 Nazi book that states that transvestites should be required to be sent to concentration camps, with the word transvestites being very equivalent to how we use the word transgender today. She also notes that being considered transvestite would lead to harsher sentences than if a trans person were considered just a homosexual man, meaning that being transgender was something seen as needing extra targeting by the Nazis. Similarly, LGBTQ and German professor Bodhi Ashton cites that trans woman Liddy Barkov was seen as a woman by Nazis who described her using feminized language and feminized pronouns, despite them charging her with the crime of homosexuality that could be used against gay men. Meaning that Nazis recognized that trans people were a thing, not something that they just had no awareness of under the idea of everyone just being homosexual. However, it's important to recognize how these targetings were very different across racialized, sexualized, all these different lines, because while people who were seen as Aryan that were part of the trans and queer community were sort of like tried to be reclaimed by the Nazis in this gross way, Jewish trans and queer people were just directly put into the Nazi concentration camps, along with many queer and trans people generally, as well as many queer and trans people from different groups like Romani folks as well, who were also targeted in the Holocaust in their own specific ways. So all of these different ways that different people were targeted are important to discuss as their own separate delineations on how Nazi rhetoric targeted them as different groups, but it's also important to notice that these are not isolated pillars. They all overlapped with each other. And the reason to recognize that is not just also for history's sake, but also to recognize how it is happening today. Something I'll be talking about in a main video that'll be going over on my main channel is like how we see this rhetoric sort of being regurgitated today, where you'll often see, if you go dig deep enough into anti-trans rhetoric that JK Rowling often espouses, you will find that there'll be people sort of saying, oh, there's the secret billionaires funding the transgender movement. People who run the healthcare industry are just trying to make money off of turning people trans and, get money off of them from surgeries, which is ridiculous bullshit nonsense.
Institutions with their money. And they created this whole political apparatus through these organizations by selling people basically on this being a human right as part of the LGB. They actually only became LGBT from like 2004 to 2006, and they all shifted. They all started to add the T. When you look at the powerful people behind this, the major corporations, major banks, international law firms, all our big technology companies, governments, politicians, at the highest echelons of Western societies, why are they all doing this?
It's a political agenda being worked out And kids are sort of a test subject because you may have very large organizations, but there's a small group of people who are controlling these organizations, and they tend to be political.
But you hear people repeating this rhetoric of the billionaires funding the transgender movement to, again, play on anti-Semitic conspiracy theories like, oh, there are a group of billionaires, globalists, Jewish people that are sort of running our society behind the scenes. People like George Soros is sort of the big one that they often point to, but there are numerous others. Like Jennifer Pritzker is also a Jewish trans person who is often always named within these rhetorics as well. So like all of these things very much tied together, but the ultimate point going back to the Nazis is that trans people, Jewish people, and many other people were targeted in the Holocaust. And while Jewish people, it's important to recognize, were the primary targets of the Holocaust, they were not the only targets, nor did these different rhetorics not intermingle with each other in numerous different ways. Now, to bring this back to JK Rowling, again, we can look at her specific tweets, but essentially what JK Rowling stated in her tweets was she denied the specific crimes that the Nazis did against transgender people. She denies that trans people were targeted by the Nazis. And she does this in a few ways. One way is she denies specific Nazi crimes, like the burning of the Institute of Sexology, which was one of the first Nazi book burnings that the Nazis did, which was an institute in Germany before the Nazis gained the overall power in the government that existed, that actually was there to study trans and queer people and was a haven for many trans and queer people, and was run by a Jewish gay man, Magnus Hirschfeld. So the Nazis targeted this specific institute to target the trans and gay people that were there, also because it tied into their rhetoric against Jewish people of Jewish people turning people trans, saying Magnus Hirschfeld was like turning people gay and trans. But it was also a targeting of trans people, and their burning of that institute set back trans research by decades, if not centuries, because of all the information that Magnus had done that was just lost because the Nazis straight up burned it. And there are also numerous other ways that trans people were targeted as well that Nazis attacked, but J.K. Rowling specifically denied that this crime of the Nazis burning the Institute of Sexology happened. She denies that happened, and she also would deny that trans people were targeted. She would even, retweet and post about people who were saying like, oh, it was gay people who were targeted by the Nazis, and trans people may have been considered part of that at times, but they were actually just targeting gay people. And while certainly there was a lot of rhetoric, again mirroring a lot of gender critical feminist rhetoric, where the Nazis said, oh, just trans people were just like, gay men or gay women who have been tricked into thinking they were the opposite sex, which again mirrors a lot of anti-trans rhetoric we see today of people just saying, oh, trans women are just gay men who are confused or autogynophiles or whatever. There was specific targeting of transgender people, and the Nazis specifically citing transgender people in their targeting as they made a distinguishment from LGBT people generally. So when J.K. Rowling is doing this, the important thing to note is that J.K. Rowling is not denying that the Holocaust happened. She is saying the Holocaust happened, but she is denying that it happened to trans people specifically. And if you go and look at laws, especially in Germany, because Germany has some of the most stringent laws on how we talk about Holocaust stuff, in Germany it's actually stated that that there's a distinguishment between denying that the Holocaust happened at all and people denying that it happened to specific people. And the distinguishment would be that that this would be called Holocaust revisionism. In fact, in 2002, a German court ruled that denying that transgender people were victims of the Nazis qualifies as a, quote, denial of Nazi crimes. Again, Kaylee and Conrad goes into this in their video really, really well and in greater detail. And in the UK, they also have a ton of very specific libel laws that are very much in support of the people really in power in that situation, which is different from the United States when we talk about libel laws. We saw this crop up actually very recently in public discourse with stuff like Johnny Depp, because there was a court case that Johnny Depp brought in the UK because the libel laws there were much more to Johnny Depp's benefit as well. And so he could bring the case there, and it would be much easier for him to win the case in that situation. So, when we look at this Brown, this journalist who tweeted that J.K. Rowling is a Holocaust denier, the laws in the UK versus also these distinguishments on like how we say like the distinguishment between Holocaust denial is like denying that the Holocaust happened generally, as well as the denial of specific crimes within the Holocaust targeting targeting trans people, targeting specific groups, there's just a lot of wiggle room for JK Rowling to use legal specificities to be able to threaten people for their wording. And so I saw after this moment on Twitter, many people sort of saying J.K. Rowling is a Holocaust denier. And I really have zero problem with anyone saying that J.K. Rowling is a Holocaust denier. I have zero issue with that at all. She is denying that trans people were targeted in the Holocaust, and that we are an important thing to understand about how we were sexualized, racialized, and just targeted by the Nazi people, and why that was a pertinent and important pillar of how they tried to enact their eugenicist ideals generally, coupled with how they targeted Jewish folks specifically as well. It all goes to how fascism is not these isolated pillars of bigotry, but how they all tie together. However, for me specifically, I try to be very specific in my statements on J.K. Rowling for a couple different reasons going on here. But number one is that technically I do business in the United Kingdom. As many as you know, I'm working on a movie, and actually several of the people that work in the film, both in the cast and crew, are from the United Kingdom. And, you know, again, I am not a lawyer, but there is an element of me being like, well, I do business in the UK. I am a prominent voice who J.K. Rowling has targeted before. She is literally, like, there was that whole thing, whatever, like year and some change ago, where she literally, like, tweeted about me and caused me to get a ton of harassment. So I am vaguely in her sphere of awareness. Whether she thinks about me at all or knows what I say, I doubt. But certainly she has done so in the past, and I would not put it past her to want to do so again. And since I do business in the UK, it's one of those things where, like, better safe than sorry. And so what I will say, to be very specific in my wording, is that J.K. Rowling denies that part of the Holocaust happened, and that she is denying crimes against transgender people by the Nazis. And by doing so, she is furthering fascistic rhetoric, as much of anti-trans hate generally does, to be able to lead to further Holocaust actual denial, further Holocaust revisionism, as well as other bigoted, fascistic, and anti-Semitic and other bigoted worldviews. And by the way, it's worth saying the reason that J.K. Rowling is doing this is because she has to be able to square it with her beliefs. You know, she has to deny that the Nazis did crimes against transgender people. She has to be able to do that, or else she has to reckon with the fact that her rhetoric is fascistic, which it is. By being able in her brain to deny that trans people were targeted by the Nazis, she is able to square that then with her rhetoric, where she says, you know, trans people are just, or trans women specifically, I should say, versus trans men, because trans men she infantilizes and does a lot of her own fucking stupid, horrible fucking bullshit with. But trans women, she says, you know, trans women are just men who are misogynistic and trying to enter our spaces, and are just confused gay men who are sexualizing their own perversions and are autogynephiles, whatever, which is the same rhetoric that the Nazis did. And thus, by segmenting off transgender people from the Nazi crimes, she can then sort of square it with her belief that, you know, trans women specifically are these villains, and trans men are these innocent young girls who need to be protected, which again falls into this larger overall eugenicist usages of trans men specifically as like young girls who need to become breeding farms, and like, oh, how dare the trans ideology harm our young girls who could become broodmares for society and again perpetuate our specific race. And yes, see, even my cat Kipo is upset at J.K. Rowling's absolute eugenicist fascistic bullshit. So like it's just gross. And this is why she's doing that rhetoric. This is not, by the way, as some people have said, me trying to break the intersectionality of understanding that both trans and Jewish people, as well as Jewish transgender people who did exist, were targeted by the Nazis. It is important to recognize that there is solidarity between trans people, Jewish people, and many other marginalized groups, because we are all targeted in different ways by fascistic systems, as we can see both with the Nazis and today, by white supremacist systems that very much come coupled with fascism, and numerous other things. Like, that is very important to recognize, and I never want to suggest that that there's some separation or like distinguishment or lack of intersectionality between these groups and discussions, it's very, very important to do so. But it's also important to recognize, too, the specificity of these terms just for our own protection, as well as it's important to make the distinguishment in our language and how we discuss these things, because we aren't all exactly targeted in the same way. Jewish people were targeted differently than trans people, and it affected people who were seen as Aryan, whether they were trans and queer, as well as people who were seen as Jewish, whether they were trans and queer or cis, or straight. Like, these things overlapped in numerous ways, but we need to be able to talk about how they were very separate. In fact, Jewish people will often use the term, again, I'm a Gentile, so please, I'm going to put the word on screen because I'm probably going to mispronounce it because I am a Gentile and do not know how to pronounce Hebrew words very well. But the Shoah, apologies on that front, blame me being a well-meaning Gentile, but they use that word as a word within the Hebrew language to be able to talk about how Jewish people in the Holocaust were targeted. And there will even be some people that will say, make a distinguishment between the word Holocaust and Nazi crimes, to say that, the Holocaust means just against Jewish people, and you can talk about genocide generally that the Nazis did towards trans and other people. It generally seems to be the overall consensus that the word Holocaust does include Jewish people, trans people, and everyone else, Romani people, everyone else who were targeted in the Holocaust, queer people generally. But again, some people may make the distinguishment. That being said, it is important to note that there are many anti-trans folks who are trying to state that the Holocaust only applies to Jewish people in order to then also obfuscate the discussion that we're trying to have, which is that trans people were victims in the Holocaust. So while there are some people who in good faith and earnestly will use the phrase Holocaust to only refer to Jewish people, and also say that yes, trans people were targeted by the Nazis, and JK Rowling targeting denying that trans people were victims of Nazi crime is Nazi crime denialism, and also denial of part of the Nazi crimes and all that stuff. There are people who are going to use this terminology in order to say, oh, well, the Holocaust only applies to Jewish people. So you saying JK Rowling is denying part of the Holocaust, or is a Holocaust denier, whatever language people are using to rightfully point out what JK Rowling is doing in order to try to erase that trans people and really anyone else besides Jewish people were already so targeted in the Holocaust. Or we'll even say like, oh, trans people weren't targeted in the Holocaust, it was just gay people who were targeted in the Holocaust, which just happened to catch some trans people involved as well. It's like, no, trans people were also specifically targeted for being trans, while there were also some trans people who were considered gay or lesbian or bisexual by the Nazis and also killed under that delineation. They were also targeted for being trans in numerous ways. And the reason that I want to point that out is to point out how often anti-trans bigots as well as anti-Semitic folks will try to use these different ways that people see these terms and how we use them in order to try to push their own bigotries and also create greater gaps in our ability to have solidarity, because they're trying to instigate fights between people. As well as, too, and this kind of goes along with that point, to point out what I am saying, again, that JK Rowling is denying the crimes of the Holocaust towards transgender people specifically, while not being a Holocaust denier in the sense that she is denying that the Holocaust happened, just who it happened to. I am not trying to, again, erode that solidarity of how these things cut across these different boundaries, nor to try to say that there was separation between trans and Jewish people in how the genocide that was faced, but how people will try to use that gap in the distinguishment or the way that we use our terms, and especially in places like social media, to be able to generate that conflict. It is something we are seeing very often being used in numerous different spaces today by different fascist and right-wing and even within left-wing spaces groups to try to erode solidarity by using these very, and I'm not saying unimportant, but very much fights over semantics and terminology and language, and the lack of being very specific in how we are defining our terms in order to generate discourses of division, in order to cause resentments, in order to cause anger between people. So it's just something to be aware of and to be thinking about, because it is something I've seen happen over and over and over again. I think most clearly in stuff like, when we discuss stuff going on in Israel and things with that, but just a lot of these conversations in a lot of stuff when we discuss bigotries, how, these little gaps in how we define our terms, how one person may interpret a term because of their history and understanding with it, will have a different definition to someone else. And while we even may agree on the sentiment, because this terminology it has different charges and different feelings towards other people, the specificity sometimes can get muddy, and as a result be wielded by those who wish to break down solidarity. I am learning in this process. So, I am open to people in the comments telling me, you're wrong, or here's some other piece of information. That's what we're trying to do here is I'm trying my best to educate, but also try to go on the education journey with people. And it's difficult because these are very difficult topics, very heated topics, very dangerous topics in numerous ways for how they are often wielded against marginalized people. And something that I also want to be very specific about, considering, stuff that I talked about on my main channel. If you haven't seen those videos around talking about how, Jewish people are being targeted today by anti-Semitism, but also they are often conflated with Israel, who is doing many genocidal actions against the Palestinian people right now, and how that often gets tied into many other anti-Semitic rhetorics, how people will conflate Israel and Judaism to not only try to protect Israel and just sort of conflate that, but also used by people who want to be anti-Semitic to be able to try to equate the actions of Israel with all Jewish people to then create an anti-Semitic sentiment in people. And this is happening both on the far right and within leftist spaces too. I've talked about in one of my main videos how the far right will try to infiltrate many anti-Israeli violence and genocidal actions against Palestinians groups in order to spread anti-Semitic rhetoric. But it is also on people within the left who are working to try to speak out against Israel's actions, and Israel's actions not just recently since Hamas's, and again I'll be very clear about this, Hamas's terrible war crimes that they committed. Israel's actions not just since October 7th, and Hamas's war crimes that they use then to justify their own actions against Palestinian people generally in a collective punishment, but also Israel's war crimes even before October 7th, as well as tying into, Hamas's war crimes before then as well. Again, it's a very complicated, long situation, and one that many people will use not only to spread Islamophobia against Palestinian people, but also anti-Semitism against Jewish people, specifically both in left-wing spaces and right-wing spaces as well. And it is the lack of these understanding these intersectionalities of these things, the specificity of these things, that it leads to furthering fascistic viewpoints. And it's why it's something that we all need to work to learn, and it's something that I am working to do my best at learning and try my best to be open about where I am learning on that, but also why I'm sharing with you where I am at in this journey as well. It's difficult because I want to be very specific. I want to be very clear in where I'm at, and I also want to speak up against violence happening right now against Jewish people, against Palestinian people, against trans people, but also understanding that there's a lot of work to be able to do to be able to talk about this in nuanced ways, but also understanding that needs to be said right now, because there is just a dire pressing need because of the way the world is right now. So I am trying my best, but I'm also not against criticism. I'm very much open to your criticism, and I hope that this has been educational to all of you, not just me trying to be like, let me tell you, but also me trying to be like, this is where I'm at, this is where I'm in my journey. I open it to you to have the conversation because I want to have further conversation on it. So yeah, that's where I'm at. Hopefully this was helpful, and I wish you all, my friends, live long and prosper.